Okay, hello everyone. Welcome to this new video, which we're going to look at the other right-wing parties that we haven't discussed yet. So instead of being a deep dive into one specific party, we're just going to look at a myriad of parties, just describe a bit about their policy, how they platform, kind of things that are unique about them, and things to consider. And the main thing that I want you to think about when you're listening to this workshop is about two kind of motions. The first one is a motion which is along the lines of this house regrets the number of parties in the Dutch political system, or this house would implement a voting threshold, which means that only if you get a certain amount of seats are you allowed to go into the second chamber in the first place, meaning that smaller parties wouldn't get in. And the other kind of motion that I want you to think about would be this house would ban parties or members to split off when they have been elected into parliament or into the second chamber. The idea is just that you wouldn't allow new fractions to be created or new parties to be created or individuals to go away from the party, start their own thing when they are in office. And I think the reason why it will be very useful to listen to this when you are thinking about these motions is you can, if you know the specifics about the Netherlands, I think you can just debate this motion if it's going to be about the Netherlands, but also if it becomes more general, because then you can understand how do these parties work, what are their strengths, what are their weaknesses, how can I characterize them, why do they do the things that they're doing, and how does this affect politics? And this is basically going to be the broad questions that we're going to be answering in this workshop. So then who are we going to talk about? So here, again, we have a very nice graph. So we'll start from the center, which is the new social contract, and we go basically to the right-leaning parties, to the most right-leaning. So we have like a 50 plus party, we have a conservative SGP party, which is a religious party, and then we have a couple of parties here, just the Farmers Party, the BBB, and then you have a lot of like just anti-immigration parties, which is Ja 21, which means yes 21. Then you have Forum for Democracy, and then you have the Dutch National Alliance, which we already talked a bit about because they split up from the PVV. So if you want to hear more about that context, do also watch the deep dive that we did on the PVV. To give you a bit more context on how big these small parties are, this is a graph which shows you the number of seats that the parties have gotten in the different elections. So 2023 was the election as like the previous parliament that we had. How much did they have in that moment? This is going to be gray. And then the red is going to be the number of seats that they have currently. And as you can see, we're not going to be talking about these big five parties, which have at least 18 plus seats. We're going to be talking about parties who have, look here, maximum 9 seats or 0 seats. And that's kind of like what we mean with these small parties. Okay, so then let's just start with the first party, the new social contract. If you want to know a lot about why the new social contract was created, there's a whole drama about this. This was a basically split off of the CDA. There was a lot of like disagreements there. It was started by a specific guy called Peter Omzicht. If you want to learn all about that, there's already a video on this YouTube channel which goes about the last uh, parliament and cabinet that we had before the new one that we had, and there I explain the drama into more detail. So basically, all I want you to show here is that the NSC basically changed the front runner into a new person. And the main problem with this new politician is that they didn't, it wasn't the same person as the person who kind of like created the party in the first place. So it was kind of really just like a party that was centered around one specific person. And it wasn't because it was like a very charismatic leader or it was kind of like a very good hardline or anything else. But it was basically because this person stood central for a lot of how do you say it, drama that basically happens within the parliament about child benefit affairs and like other crises. And he was very critical. And even though his party still stood for these general principles, the combination of him leaving because he had basically burned out and he stopped because of that, and a new person taking over, meant that all of that characterization got like the trust in this specific person didn't translate to the new people, as well as the party, the new social contract, not really being able to do a lot of good in the last parliament that they were part of, like last coalition they were part of. So it's the combination of these two things, which kind of like shows you how quick a party can die because they had seats before and now they have 0 seats. They were part of like the coalition before and now they aren't even in the parliament and chamber, not able to submit any motions, to be part of the discussions, anything like that. And that can shows you how fragile these split ups can be in the first place. They can become part of the coalition, they do really poorly, and then they basically die. And I think here there were also some specific right. So I talked about the reason why the main person, Peter Omzicht, actually stopped was because um, he was burned out. But this was something that already happened before as well. So even when Peter Omzicht was like working for the CDA, he also had issues of like burnout because he was really like what we call he was really looking into the files and doing like deep dive research and trying to really work out what was happening and be very critical and basically putting a lot of work there. So there's a combination of just personal factors here of this person being a workaholic and therefore burning himself out before and now also when there's a party, which made it happen. But also something structural, which is when there is a party here that is relatively new, maybe doesn't have as much institutional memory, doesn't have maybe as much structures. Yes, you get maybe a lot of votes and you may be part of the coalition, but you are still relatively smaller party, which is needed for the coalition, but you don't have as much sway as maybe like a really big party like the PVV or the VVD. It means it is really hard to have a internal line that might be strong, that is what people believe in, and like you're able to execute well or experience how to navigate these kind of like discussions or navigate these kind of political tactically things. So again, one of the example was that NSC was about transparency, good governance, all that kind of stuff. So then when there was criticism and there was like questions about research into specific policies that were created by the coalition, the other parties didn't really want to show that. They didn't really want to talk about it because it might actually put them in a bad light. But the NSC made the decision, well, actually, because we are a transparency party, we're fine with actually allowing you to do this. Like, we think this is fine. We will support this motion. We suppose this research you're going to be doing. Which shows on the one hand, like, this is good, right? Because this is something that maybe a seasoned politician wouldn't do. And it shows a consistency with their own framework. But it politically wasn't very good and salient because the policy was just not implementable because it was not really following law and all that kind of stuff. And this was about the migration policy and all this kind of stuff. And I think this kind of shows the good but also the negative side of having these kind of parties is that they can be good, but then once they don't support and they don't really work or they aren't as politically savvy, or there might be internal things happening that just are tied to just the persons who are in there, then they can fall. And I think this is a very interesting line, this going from a coalition member towards being a party that doesn't have a seat into the parliament. Now, the next party I want to talk about is Ja 21, which translates to Yes 21. And basically, the interesting thing here is this is the largest party that we're going to talk about today, which has 9 seats, as we saw. And the reason why they became big is because they're mainly just an anti-immigration party. And what they kind of like characterize themselves is as kind of like the reasonable anti-immigration. So they were more anti-immigration than the VVD, but they were still more reasonable than the PVV. And this was important because the VVD kind of couldn't really go hardcore in immigration anymore. Like they still wanted to make it a big issue and they didn't want to lose voters to the right. So they still talk about immigration, but they couldn't do as much hardlining as they've tried before because they were part of like the coalition and weren't able to really put things through. And they would potentially have the same issues, right? If they try to say, oh, we're gonna implement X, Y, Z policy, but it's not gonna be effective, or it might not actually be able to be passed because it's against constitutional law or judicial framework that we have in the Netherlands, then it will just be kind of again political suicide. So because the VVD slightly like still talked about immigration, and again we have a deep dive on the VVD and I go into more detail about this, but still wasn't as hardcore. Yeah, and was able to become more hardcore, but still more reasonable than the PVV, because as we also said within the video about the PVV, a lot of the plans are simple solutions, things that sound good, but nothing that really is on paper. And yeah, 21 was kind of like the more reasonable version. So the people who voted normally maybe for PVV, but thought it was irrational or they didn't able to get in policy, they're voting for Ja 21. Or the people who felt like the VVD wasn't able to push things through and maybe had a tactical vote where they thought, if I vote for this party and they are part of the coalition, it will vote more to migration. So the kind of people that vote here are also still maybe somewhat more highly educated people, not necessarily people who are very, very poor and very, very much focusing on, the more basic rhetoric for the PVV, because those most likely still vote for PVV, because this is trying to face itself as a more reasonable party about anti-immigration. So the kind of people who vote are different than the people who vote for the PVV, and therefore kind of like captured some of the votes for the VVD and that kind of stuff. So that is basically characterizing this party. Everything else is just it's a right wing party. It's mainly focusing on this. it has other things about like being right wing, so not having as much policy about like expanding like the state funding and maybe having more money for defense, but not having as much state oversight. The generic right wing policies. But the main platform and the main thing that they're known for is just anti-immigration policies that they want to get implemented. Then the BBB, which was the farmers movement or the farmers party. Again, if you want to understand why this party became really, really big, there was a video that I did about the last coalition where I also talk about what are the issues that we have with the nitrogen crisis, why farmers really voted for this party. And if you really want to go and understand that, I would just suggest you watch that video because it just explains that into more detail that I can do now. But basically, the Farmers Party, again, was also quite big. It was a new party. It hasn't existed for that long. I think just from the top of my head, roughly like 6 years, 4 years, something like that is how long it's been existing. And it basically just got called because there was an issue in the part, like issue in the Netherlands, where it felt farmers weren't representative. And it shows you potentially like the good sides of this, right? If you have small parties that are able to easily exist, then it's able to form and go about an issue that's really, really big and it's able to represent them. The main issue, though, that happens with the BP is that it's a new party. And if you look at their, front runner that used to be Caroline van der Plas, it had the benefit of being seen as a kind of like normal woman, like not a politician, but someone who kind of like understands the people and understands the farmers. So it doesn't use big jargon, doesn't use like the political tricks about like um, the way they speak to the media, and it's a bit more straightforward. Doesn't mean that she doesn't sometimes not answer the question or try to wiggle way around, but it is at least perceived as more representative people rather than the average politician. Similarly, the strength, which is it is just a normal party, is also kind of like its weakness, because then it doesn't really create, for example, policy that is consistent or budgets that count up completely or things that are, what you would want to have in a well-functioning party don't exist as a consequence because it's a new party. So this shows against the strength of representation, but also the weakness, which is actual implementing this and working within the political system. Now, Caroline van der Plas actually stepped down, and as a consequence, something similar happened to the and as happened with the new social contract, which was basically there was a bit of a divide, and there was because it was all after still Caroline van der Plas was a front runner, it wasn't it isn't performing as well now. So Caroline van der Plas basically stepped down, and what happened is you had a split where basically you have two people that had very different beliefs about what the party should do. So this is Mona Keizer, and she basically believed that what they should do is yes, it is a farmers' party, but what we should do is we should be broader, which means we should also focus more on anti-immigration. And she was also one of the ministers in the last coalition that was for basically living and like building and all the kind of stuff. So housing, that kind of stuff. The main issue is that normally you would expect her to be the front runner because she is relatively young, she is charismatic, she has already been seen in the light. But she had to believe that we should be more broader and also focus more on anti-immigration policy to capture a larger base. However, there was a disagreement internally where they actually wanted to go for another kind of like policy, which is just focusing again more on the farmers, so not losing your identity. And this is a question that these small parties always have to ask. Are we going to go more general, or are we going to stay relatively focused on the one specific issue? And here, that disagreement led to basically Mona Keizer just leaving the party and starting her own party, which is then just called, I think, something along the line of Party Mona Keizer. Now, this is the person who's now the frontrunner for the BBB. I have looked up the name and I had written it down somewhere, but I think it shows that I've already forgotten his name. Like he's not that memorable. He's not charismatic. He isn't very well known, all this kind of stuff. And the farmers movement, the farmers party has just shrunk in size, so isn't as much in the news anymore. So this also shows the issue with these small parties is sometimes there's just issues with succession where there might be a split into the party, but also if you just don't have enough people who might actually form good leaders, you just mean that you just have a forgettable person as the head of the party. Since then, as the Farmers Party, they haven't really changed that much. Like they still have the same issues about, institutional strength. Arguably, it's become worse because they have less votes in the first place or less people in parliament in the first place, which means that they have less things they can push through. And also, just the same thing they talk about is just farmers, protecting farmers, all the kind of stuff. But because they're not in the coalition right now, all the things that they can do is just be opposition and just be critical and argue against policies rather than proposing any things or having any ministries, or ministerial posts, and all that kind of stuff. So this is also again the farmers' movement and how it is currently situated within the Netherlands. And by the way, this fall off was not just on the sense of on the level of the national government. This was also actually on provincial level and municipal level, where they also got less votes than before, because there was suddenly like a huge surge of them when they were first created on the municipal and the provincial level, and has also died down. And I think this shows kind of like the ebbs and waves of parties and how big they become within the Netherlands. And you can also have all of these opinions about what this does for policy. Does it make maybe inconsistent? Maybe it means more representative. Maybe it means that more issues actually get tackled, and that you're willing to maybe take more um, controversial decisions, or at least push things through that aren't just done because this is how we've always done it, because you now suddenly have other parties coming into play. Now, let's get into Forum for Democracy, which is the second largest party that we're discussing here, where I think have roughly 7 seats. And this is a controversial party because it's also very right wing. But I think the way to understand this voter base is those younger, edgy, higher educated people who basically got down the YouTube rabbit hole of becoming more right wing and all this kind of stuff. So they listen to like, I don't know, like Milo Yiannopoulos and all these kind of controversial people who are like very right wing, have some conspiracy theories about this, and they believe a variety of things. So firstly, is that they are one of the only parties that denied that climate change existed in the first place. So they say, the nitrogen crisis actually isn't a nitrogen crisis, because if we put a shit ton of nitrogen in the ground, other plants would just survive. So we just adapt it. But then the main issue is, well, actually, the issue is that you basically create a monoculture. So only specific plants can survive, and it's not good for the ecosystem. And still, there are other issues that happen when you just have this pollution, right? So you can, there's general pollution. You might have got, for example, sour or acid rain, which then also breaks down buildings, it breaks down stones and all the kind of stuff. It might be good for insect populations, which are important, for example, bees and all these other things, which might also get affected. But they're just saying very simple things about like, but there's still some growth, so therefore it isn't that bad. They also go further for like, there isn't real climate change or it is mitigable, all that kind of stuff. They were also for a bit of time the only party who was more Russian friendly than Ukraine friendly. They kind of stepped down from that opinion because they had to, but it shows they kind of like try to be contrarian, in the sense that they just try to frame that everything basically the left and the normal right elite kind of like comes up with is just kind of like bullshit, and we know how it really is, and gets into close of like conspiracy thinking and that kind of stuff. This also is actually for migration policy, so they also have a lot of like anti-immigration, very strict stuff that they don't like. They don't want asylum seekers. They don't have asylum seeker centers built anywhere. What most, kind of like conservative right-wing parts do. But I think what is unique here about Forum for Democracy is that on the municipal and also on a provincial level, they have people who have been aligned with like far right, white nationalist organizations. And this isn't just like a left wing people saying, "Oh, the woke people saying, oh, you're Nazis because you're anti-immigration, all that kind of stuff." No, these are just like people who actually were members or organizers of parties which say white pride, where they would have meetings where they would show like the Nazi symbolism, and like the Nazi flag around in their meetings and that kind of stuff. So this is real things that we have video evidence of. And the main thing and how they use this is basically saying, we're not going to talk about people in the past or like what they did in the past. They have changed or all that kind of stuff. And basically taking a non-committing stance and saying like there isn't an issue, or even if you have evidence, then actually it's in the past, so it doesn't matter, and that kind of stuff. And this makes this party really controversial. So when you understand, for example, the right and like how you get facturing, Forum for Democracy is one of those parties who is very, very unlikely to ever be in a coalition, except for if it is a super right wing coalition. So only if it's like maybe PVV, Yes 21, Forum for Democracy, and if VVD has completely lost their head and suddenly want to work with these very extreme parties, only then they would get part of it. And the opposition that they create as a consequence also isn't actually very good as a consequence. So because they are very extreme, they are more conspiratorial, they are more framing things as the elite and framing things as um yeah, framing things in a way that's just not going to be productive. So this is definitely one of those parties where if people say people might vote for this party, it's a specific kind of people who vote for them, especially also because the leaders tend to use a lot of like jargon and use a lot of like high, like very difficult words and that kind of stuff. So this is why I said this is just for oftentimes young people who got kind of like into a rabbit hole. Others also more highly educated because again they kind of like for themselves, we know it better, we know it smarter. The elite is not knowing what they should do and that kind of stuff, which also means that the kind of people that get voted for them also are from a specific group, and so shows potential limitations of how far they can really grow. They need to change that image. They need to change the way that they've been talking about policy to be able to get a wider group in the first place and become a real threat on the right. And that's kind of like important to know in the context of how far right wing should the DVD go, for example, to still capture these people. How good is it that we have these parties in the first place? Would they exist in the first place if you would put an electoral threshold and that kind of stuff? So this is just the form for democracy. Now, after all the extremism, it's going to be a bit nice because now we're going to go back to the center, and this is 50 plus. 50 plus is just what it sounds like. It is basically a party for old people. So it's for people who are older 50 plus, most of their interests are uh, going to be represented. And I think here, these are things like the pension age shouldn't go up too much. We should spend more money for pension. We should help elderly people. They don't want to have too many taxes on capital. So, for example, houses and all that kind of stuff, because who have the most houses and the most capital? They actually are older people. And I think here there's a very interesting dynamic about what representation is, because if you look at which demographic in the Netherlands has the most money, the most capital in the form of like stocks, in the form of houses and all that kind of stuff, those are old people. So this is a representation of a party that is representing people who are overall, stronger and are overall already economically better off. That doesn't mean that there aren't any poor people who are older who maybe have issues maintaining their house, who have maybe a lot of expenses, who aren't as well off, but it is still showing that just because you're representing a group and this group might already be powerful doesn't mean that necessarily this is a net good or a net bad. It kind of like shows a more nuanced case of why this might be positive, why this might be negative, and why it might be good to have these parties in parliament. Currently, they have around 2 seats. They used to have 0 seats, and it's kind of like a party that goes in and out of the second chamber. Sometimes they have enough voters, sometimes they don't. And everything else that they basically have is just generic right wing policy. So the state shouldn't intervene too much, except of course helping for with elderly people. They shouldn't higher the age for say they should higher the age for when you can go with pensions. But also we don't want to have too many taxes. We want to have somewhat strong migration policy. Again, understanding that the people that vote for you are going to be old. They oftentimes kind of like have a nostalgia or remembrance of when society was less multicultural and people didn't really have and still don't have as maybe as much networking with people from different cultural backgrounds. That is why you still have older people maybe being more conservative on this front, having still stereotypes that they've had been taught their whole life about certain groups of people and migrants and all that kind of stuff, which means that they still have a strong stance for migration, but they aren't as conservative or as strong about migration or anything else because they're also not necessarily a one issue party, but more of a one group party. And they need to be broad enough that they can still go within the elders of 50 plus for them to vote for them, but still also specific enough for them to have a clear image that they go for. And that's why they focus mainly on, the pensions, maybe a bit on migration, but they aren't very strong on anything else. All right. Then the SGP or SGP, basically this is a very conservative party. This is basically for it's a very religious party, and it is one of those parties who has been in the news a lot for the reason that they are the party that didn't allow women to be on the voting ballot. So they themselves internally decided this is what they're going to do. And it kind of shows you how conservative the Netherlands still has. So if you remember one of the geopolitical or geographical videos they did about Dutch politics, you know that there's a Bible Belt. And basically, this is where they're really strong. And the SGP is one of those parties who always gets the same amount of seats. So they get like 2 or 3 seats. There isn't really an ebb and flow. And the reason is people in the Bible Belt vote for them because they're only ones representing their conservative values and they believe in the things that the SGP is talking about. But as a consequence, they're also quite off-putting. So no one outside of the Bible Belt really is going to vote for them. So they're more conservative. They are maybe not directly outspoken against gay rights, but also I feel like this would be the party where if it is one of those things where a policy gets pushed through, such as maybe allowing schools to have more freedom to see how they depict queer people and all this kind of stuff, or even evolution of theory, that is what they would push for. And if there would be an actual policy to be like, actually, we're going to go away from gay marriage, most likely they would also vote in favor. But I think they understand that this is conservative enough that it would piss off too many people that they just are unable to go for that policy. As well as you could argue that the reason why this is not the case is that even in the Bible region, and they're slowly getting more progressive and progressive. So in this region, there is still discrimination. You still have schools, for example, teaching that evolution actually didn't happen. It was just that, God created everything. And this is just a scan that you need to be taught so that you can pass your exam for biology. And that's like genuine thing that happens. But there are also more and more like gay people who are maybe moving back to these areas or people who've been exposed via universities to more of these people. And that is why there might be also a slowly becoming more progressive, but it is still one of those things where it is very, very conservative. Again, this is the party that is known for not allowing women on the candidate list, and members within the party saying that, yeah, actually, I wouldn't vote for a woman as politician. That's not maybe her role, or I think men are just in general a bit more rational, and this is kind of like how God created us and wanted this, and that kind of like means that SGP is always going to be a conservative party. I think this is interesting with politics because if this is a group of people who always vote for the SGP and they always will be voting for them and never vote for a different party, this means that other parties never have an interest to really cater to this conservative group, which might actually be good or bad. So you could say it's bad because it just means that we have three seats that will always be in the opposition because it's just that conservative. You might say it's actually good because otherwise what you might have is that this would maybe go become part of the VVD and then you have a very conservative party, like part in the party, that might shift it more towards the conservative side, which means that a lot more regressive policies at least get listened to. Where even if they aren't actively regressive, they allow for more regression to happen. So think again about the schooling example. So if it is one of those things where you have now a party, part of your party that is very conservative, they might want to have schools have way more power over curriculum, which necessarily sounds very conservative. You could say this is it's good for the market. You get like different competition. It's good for religious diversity, all that kind of stuff. But as a consequence, it would embolden the things that, the SGP wants to do, which might be anti-evolution, anti like gay people, anti-trans schools, all that kind of stuff. So that would be a thing that would maybe be implemented more. Or you could say it also leads to more infighting in the party because now you have this conservative section, you have a more progressive section. They disagree. This means that there might be less efficiency in deciding what you're actually going to platform on. It might actually also make it less enjoyable to actually be part of the party because you just feel that there's just fraction that's going to be quite, different and all that kind of stuff. And I think that would be an interesting way this could, for example, impact politics in general. So then the next party and the last party that we talk about is the Dutch National Alliance or DNA. I think this was already discussed in more depth in the PVV deep dive. But again, it shows to a large extent why small parties overall do more radical things to be able to get attention. So as we said in that video, DNA, the Dutch National Alliance, basically split up from the PVV because there was a disagreement internally about the course of the PVV and what has happened and accountability and the way that the party was just inherently structured. And they started their own party. But what always happens when a new party pops up is they need attention. Because if there are all of these parties, as you can see on the screen right now, who want to get people to vote for them, you need to stand out. So this is like a very classical right, like conservative right wing thing that you try to do, which is say something very controversial, try to rage bait the opposition, which might be other right wing parties or the left, saying things like, "Oh, we need to protect people, our nation from refugees, even if they are Palestinian refugees, and we should use like weapons to defend ourselves against this because it's a significant enough threat." And this is one of those things where it is like plausible deniability, where you say, no, no, we only mean people who are like violent or we have just too many, we can handle this. And then it might be an attack to us and we can't handle it, we can help our own population. And then we should protect ourselves. But we shouldn't just straight up, start killing Palestinians and all that kind of stuff. But of course, other parties are going to respond to this because this is quite a poor thing to say. But they're going to basically use the text like, oh, but that's not exactly what I said, or that's not what I meant, or all that kind of stuff. But it creates a lot of attention. Like you'll have discussions in the parliament, which will take a long time, where there will be a lot of parties just saying, what you're saying is important and this and that. And every time someone says that, they have time to respond in the parliament, which means they can farm clips they can put online and be like, oh, we're being misrepresented by people, or oh, we are standing our ground to protect the Dutch identity and all that kind of stuff. And also, it becomes part of the news cycle. It becomes part of things that people see in the news, in talk shows. People talk about why this is bad and why we shouldn't do it. And there will always be an apologist there saying, like, but this is not what they meant, or this is representing a sentiment that people have. So it is fair for them to say this in the parliament. And you're just giving more ground for them to explain their position and to get more attention. And I think this is a thing that you could say is quite toxic in the sense, and might be bad, because again, it's just rage baiting and then just not actually talking about policy or having good policy implements just so you can exist in the first place to then continue to be opposition because again you are controversial. The more controversial statements make, the more you get in. There's a consequence. The more controversial you are, the less likely parties are to actually willing to form a coalition with you. So that means that you just have parties in the system that are inherently not going to be able to do anything constructively, but only just put in opposition and be controversial for the sake of being controversial to get that attention. Now, in this case, you might say this is, we are left-leaning debaters, so we say this is bad. But I want to note that you could also say this is actually good in some examples. So, for example, we talk a bit more about when we talk about left-leaning things, but you could also talk about people from a specific migration background need to be represented, or people with a specific religious minority being represented, or maybe this also needs to happen for things like nature and climate change, where you make very controversial claims about climate change that are good and saying I actually need to change this when you actually just completely overthrow the economy. The economy doesn't matter. And you're sort of rage baiting the right and be like, no, but the economy is important for jobs, this and that. And then you're able to maybe platform policies that might be good. Like again, when it comes to parties, it isn't always black and white, whether a policy is good in the first place or whether drawing attention to it is good. But it is important to understand what the underlying mechanism is and the underlying interest of these parties and what this then does structurally towards politics. How does this create coalition forming? What does this do for how voters interact with politics in the first place? How likely does it make for people to want to engage with politics in the first place? And all of these questions you can answer when you understand what these parties do and why, and have concrete examples that you can point to. And I think this is important, like I said, for the motions that we discussed. Should these parties that are small be allowed to be in the parliament in the first place? Is it fair for them to become more radical and put things on the agenda? Is it fair for them to represent a small group of people and therefore maybe block any process you could have? But also, how does this interact with actual existing parties and their internal party structures? And all of those things are things you can now hopefully understand and do and use in debates. And hopefully this is all very clear. So this should be the last party that we're going to discuss in this specific video. If you want another video where we go over the more left-leaning parties, as you can see already here, we do have them as well. I'll make a new video about that. I'll explain that. And if you have any other questions, you put them in the comments and I'll answer them there. Okay, good luck and see you in the next video.